Forests provide a range of vital environmental services, including carbon sequestration, biodiversity preservation, temperature regulation, soil conservation, and water regulation and conservation. Their illegal logging destroys homes, it endangers our water supply, and it endangers species and affects culture. Despite its active plantation timber industry, Australia has in recent years imported increasing amounts of timber to the value of approximately $6.9 billion in 2022-2023. We import timber from 135 countries, the top 5 of which are China, New Zealand, Indonesia, Germany and Malaysia. The Ministry for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry recently noted that as much as 10% of our annual timber and wood-based imports could be with illegally logged timber. That trade in illegal imports globally reduces the price of legal timber, such as in our own plantation stock, by as much as 7 to 16%. We already have a regulatory framework aimed at reducing the harmful environmental, social and economic impacts of illegal logging. The Illegal Logging Prohibition Act of 2012 and its regulations apply both to the import into this country of raw and processed timber products and the processing of domestically grown raw logs. They require importers and processors to conduct a structured risk assessment process before importing a regulated timber product or processing domestically grown raw logs. Several reviews of Australia's timber legality framework have been conducted over the last decade, and this bill will implement improvements identified as needed in 2 of those: the statutory review of the Illegal Logging Prohibition Act of 2012 and the sunsetting review of the Illegal Logging Prohibition Regulation of 2012. I note that the statutory review conducted by the then Department of Agriculture and Water Resources found determining the extent to which the Act has achieved the government's policy objectives remains challenging. And this was because, and again I quote, there was limited concrete data available to measure the impact of the Act. In fact, that review relied largely on internal departmental data, including compliance assessments, on trade data, on information obtained in previous reviews and even on anecdotal evidence. The subsequent sunsetting review of the regulation found that as much as 40% of imported timber is misrepresented in terms of its both species and its origin, and that the department's reliance on desktop audits for compliance action is both inefficient and ineffective. It found that the legislative framework does not allow for emerging technical solutions and that our timber legality framework lags behind best practice developments in other jurisdictions. Now, the sunsetting of those regulations has now been deferred until the 1st of April 2025, and we don't yet have a draft of the proposed replacement regulations. Deputy Speaker, those matters are of concern, but my interest in this bill relates primarily to Section 15, which relates to the processing of domestically grown but illegally logged raw logs. Because the sad fact is that while there clearly are significant issues with illegal logging internationally, this issue is a big problem domestically too, and there is a reason why there are fewer swift parrots in this world than there are orangutans. In my own home state of Victoria, logging is theoretically regulated by the Code of Practice for Timber Production of 2014. However, between 2009 and 2017, more than 300 breaches of this code were submitted to the forest regulator within the Victorian Department of Environment, Land and Water and Planning, and not a single breach was prosecuted. In 2019, an independent report into DELP's failure to monitor or regulate logging found that it had neither the capacity nor the capability to achieve its objectives. Those violations of the law led to numerous court cases in which local community groups have prosecuted the Victorian Government's logging agency, VicForests, for illegal logging. The Victorian Government's shameful and quixotic response has been to repeatedly change the Timber Production Code to make it harder for communities to take legal action against VicForests. Further, in response to local communities surveying for threatened species and for illegal logging within native forests, and for their protests within logging coops, the Victorian Government has enacted laws that threaten community members with a $21,000 fine or 12 months in jail. Communities keep fighting back. In October 2022, Warburton Environment Inc won a landmark Supreme Court case against Vic Forests over the agency's failure to protect tree G-bungs from logging. Also in 2022, the Victorian Supreme Court found that Vic Forests broke the law in failing to protect endangered gliders when logging in Gippsland and in central Victoria. In late 2023, the Victorian Supreme Court ordered Vic Forests to halt salvage logging in the Wombat State Forest after a community group alleged that Vic Forests had failed to survey appropriately for threatened species. Vic Forests had used a computer program with habitat distribution models. It had used a computer program to survey for threatened species. And it argued in court that a desktop analysis should suffice in determining the presence or absence of endangered species in forests. In this, as in other matters, Vic Forests has misled the public. Deputy Speaker, just yesterday, The Age reported on the death of an endangered greater glider on a Victorian Department of Environment tree felling site in the Yarra Ranges National Park. Forest Fire Management Victoria has been removing what it claims are hazardous trees in that national park to maintain a strategic fuel break. On May the 6th, Matt Ruckel, the Executive Director of the Victorian National Parks Association, warned the Fire Management Agency. He warned the Department Secretary and the federal and the state ministers' offices about sightings of greater gliders and leadbeater's possums in trees identified for removal. The Victorian State Government, through its agent Vic Forests, is acting in active contravention of the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. That Act requires the referral, assessment and approval of all operations likely to have significant impacts on listed threatened species. Yesterday, an endangered greater glider was found dead in that coop as a direct result of the neglect of Vic Forests. I call today on the Federal Environment Minister to act immediately to halt the illegal actions of Vic Forests and to hold the Victorian Environment Minister to account for these activities. Deputy Speaker, the Victorian Government officially ended harvesting of our state forests on the 1st of January 2024. This announcement was welcome, but it was quite misleading. While logging operations, which were part of the state's timber release plan, have come to an end, this did not apply to logging operations under the Timber Utilisation Plan. That plan relates to logging coops in the Western Defined Forest Area, most of which expire in June 2024. But there is as yet no clarity in what happens to those areas after June. Despite the fact that native forest logging has officially ceased during the first half of this year, Vic Forests has continued to remove large logs from the Wombat State Forest under the guise of debris clean-up or salvage logging. And it has allegedly continued to sell those logs via its vehicle, Forest Fire Management Victoria. How the Victorian State Government plans to manage forests after Vic Forests ceased to exist on the 1st of June is unclear. The plan for the employees of Vic Forests is unknown. And it's utterly unclear how we're going to continue to monitor for illegal logging in our native forests after that date. What we could do is clear. We should ban the sale of all timber cut as part of salvage logging or debris clean-up in native forests. There should be no market for wood obtained in the process of logging for fire breaks and other so-called fire protection measures. Only by abolishing those markets altogether can we stop the exploitation and abuse of the existing rules around timber. Deputy Speaker, in 2021 the Victorian State Government pledged a commitment to establish 3 new national parks which would legally protect the central west areas of Victoria from future natural resource exploitation. Those parks are not due to be legalised until 2030. They include the Lederdeg Wombat National Park, the Pyrenees and the Mount Bangor National Park. Until those parks are legalised, logging of those state forests can continue. So I call on the state government to immediately enact the Victorian Forest Plan for Industry Transition, which includes diverting a proportion of commercial timber plantations from export to support our local industry, thereby ensuring the sustainable local production of high-grade timber products. There will be many retraining and other work opportunities in replanting programs for logged areas. These should include programs to address soil erosion, protect our water catchments, and monitor the health of our forests. We could improve our plantation wood production so that instead of exporting 97% of our plantation eucalypt pulp logs, we process them on country, creating Australian jobs. The Australian Government also needs to work with the Victorian State Government to establish the proposed Great Forest National Park, thereby protecting and expanding the habitat of many endangered species and linking isolated forest reserves. The governments should collectively bring forward and prioritise the formation of those 3 new national parks. And at the same time, it makes sense to better fund and promote tourism, education, cultural awareness, and management programs relating to Victoria's magnificent native forests, including funding for jobs in environmental protection and forest restoration in collaboration with First Nations people. Those programs could support positive alternatives such as small-scale farm industry and sustainable social enterprises such as the Ceres Fair Wood scheme. Deputy Speaker, this Act previously required that a statutory review be undertaken after 5 years of the legislation. This was in a section which has actually been repealed by this bill, but it hasn't been replaced with any further requirements for regular statutory reviews of the Act's operation and effectiveness. Rather, the bill suggests that the Secretary could, at his or her discretion, publish reports about the operation of this Act, or could not, as the case might be. This contrasts pretty starkly with the frameworks for control of illegal logging in other jurisdictions. In the EU, timber regulation is subject to 6 yearly reviews, and it requires publication of a biannual report on the application of regulation based on information provided by the Member States. In Canada, an annual report on infrastructure administration of the relevant Act has to be tabled in Parliament, and a yearly review of enforcement provisions tabled in Parliament. The EIA and CIEL have also recommended that the government publish an annual report of compliance activities, due diligence checks and any other relevant enforcement actions, including fines, court cases and audits, as well as publication of third-party substantiated concerns. Given particularly that the statutory report that we've already seen identified high levels of non-compliance with the previous iteration of this legislation, and given the notable, frequent and egregious violations of these legislation domestically, the legislation has to be accompanied by regular monitoring and by transparent reporting of its effectiveness. Victorians deserve clarity about the state and federal government's plans for the management of native forests in our state. We deserve to know that the regulatory framework around domestic timber is such that illegally logged timber will be identified and that persons removing timber illegally from protected areas will be dealt with appropriately. We need to know that this legislation will be subjected to appropriate statutory review, sufficient to provide reassurance regarding compliance, due diligence and the responses to concerns of interested third parties. I will be moving an amendment to this bill during its consideration in detail stage in order to push the government further in action of this area, with an aim to appropriate review of this bill at reasonable periods. And I signal to the government my commitment to further action in this area.